My name is Michael Guyot, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me here is Chris Porter, who in his handle has the word demographic in his handle. So I think it'll be a worthwhile conversation here. Chris, for those who are not familiar with who you are, talk about your background. How'd you get involved in the demography field of study, and what are you doing now?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Michael, and apologize here for the technical difficulties. So I work with John Burns Real Estate Consulting. I've been with the company now for about 17 years. Company's just over 20 years old. John Burns and I have been having demographic conversations for 20 plus years. He and I used to work at a magazine for home builders. He was a contributing columnist. And one of the very first conversations that we had was about a demographic issue, and that was the rise of the Hispanic homebuyer back 20 years ago. And so that just really kicked off our conversation. I joined John's company back in 2005. We do research and consulting in the home building space and all of residential real estate, I should really say. But about 9 years ago, in the wake of the great financial crisis, we had sensed that there was a big shift in the consumer behavior, and we really wanted to understand why. And so we revisited that whole demographics conversation we had and said, look, if housing is the biggest part of people's budgets, it's the mortgage payment. The home that they buy is the biggest purchase most people are going to make in their lives. If you're a renter your whole entire life, the rent is the biggest part of your budget every month. This is a really important thing, and we think there's some real learnings we can get from the demographics world to help us gauge the demand for housing, whether that's for sale, for rent. And so we dug into census data. We dug into all these third-party sources to really understand what's going on demographically in our company and to bring some more clarity to that demographics conversation, because I think there's a lot of confusion, and we can get into some of that confusion in our conversation today. But we just want to bring some real clarity to the conversation, and let's put some real numbers behind some of these things instead of just throwing anecdotes out there about here's what the boomers are doing or here's what the millennials are doing, so we can actually make some predictable forecasts or some reasonable forecasts about what's going to happen in housing based on these demographic underpinnings.
I had, I think your colleague, Rick Palacios, on one of these spaces not too long ago talking about housing. So in the here and now, which we'll touch on. But let's first talk about the link between demographics and wealth, because I think most people will equate the underlying demand for housing or for rentals based on obviously cash flow and net assets, right? So talk about that dynamic and how that may have become more complicated post GFC.
Sure. So so I think, and I actually was listening to part of Rick's conversation with you this morning on my drive in. One of the things so much of people's wealth is tied up in their home, right? They've got, especially over these last couple of years, as they built up equity, a lot of their net worth is built into their home. But that's not something they can necessarily. It's not as tangible an asset. They can't tap into that quite as easily as if they have cash in their pocket. Yes, we've seen a lot of the rise in net worth here over the last couple of years, for sure, tied to that increase in home values. And so those who have not been able to get into housing are at a bit of a disadvantage versus those who bought, in the wake of the great financial crisis and saw that equity in their home rise.
And a lot of that, I would think, is probably concentrated. A lot of that home ownership is concentrated among baby boomers as opposed to millennials or a younger generation, which we'll define too. But how does that dynamic of concentration of wealth from a demographic perspective impact longer term secular trends in housing? Because on the one hand, you can make the case that means you're going to have more rentals. On the other hand, it just means that probably more younger people will live with their parents.
No, you're exactly right. And, I think, this is a really interesting time that we're in right now, because we've got this massive wave of boomers who, you're right, they've got 80% plus home ownership. They've got a lot of their wealth tied up in their home, but they also have, some pretty strong portfolios. Over the next couple of decades, we're going to see a pretty massive transfer of that wealth to the younger generations. And so, that could help spur on some additional home buying activity for those young adults who have had to delay household formation or buying a home. They could see some of that wealth transferred to them, and that would help them with their home buying process. I do think that we're already seeing some of that, even though maybe some of these boomers haven't passed away, but they are passing on more of their assets to their younger generation, helping them get that kickstart into into home ownership. by helping them with the down payment. And so we are seeing some of that. And I have to think that's led to some of the increase in homeownership here over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and also I think impacts the inventory. I know everyone often references inventory is low because of the shock that COVID was to the system, but there are other dynamics presumably when it comes to housing inventory, which we'll touch on. But let's take a step back for a moment and talk about the book that you authored, Big Shifts Ahead: Demographic Clarity for Business. Because again, I want to make this more than just a discussion around housing, but what are the implications on the economy more broadly on visible trends that don't seemingly change that easily, right? From a secular perspective, lay out the thesis behind the book, why you wrote it, and if anything has changed since you wrote it, or perhaps accelerated.
Sure. So we wrote the book back in 2016, very data intensive book. So obviously there's been a lot more data that's come out in these last 6 years. And we can see where we hit the mark or we missed it. But really, we wanted to, like I said, and the title suggests it, we wanted to bring more clarity to this demographic conversation. So we're all used to these conventional generation definitions, the boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials. But quite frankly, we've got, 100 and some people here on the Twitter space right now. I'd probably get 100 different definitions of what a millennial is. If I polled this audience, because nobody can agree on that. And yes, there's different groups out there that have their definitions, but I think it's pretty widely accepted. The boomers were born 1946 to 1964. Gen X starts in 1965, but then it starts to get a little bit more muddy as to where does Gen X end, where does the millennial generation begin. And then, at the time we were writing the book in the mid 2010s, if you were looking at the millennials as a group born between 1980 and 2000, let's say, you had the oldest of them were in their mid 30s. They were married with 2 kids and a white picket fence and a home that they owned. The youngest of them were still in high school. And so how can you make informed decisions about what the millennials are doing if you've got such a wide disparity in these two ends of the generation? And so, same thing with the boomers. Somebody born in 1946 and somebody born in 1964 have had very different life experiences. And so we said these generation definitions are just way too broad. Can we come up with a better system of looking at generations to really do a better job of forecasting and decide who is the generation that is starting these trends, who is shifting these trends, who's reversing trends? And so we came up with a thesis where we looked at the generations by decade born, which is great because it's nice 10-year increments. You can compare one generation to the next in a apples for apples comparison, instead of comparing one generation that's 19 years in length with another generation that's 21 years in length. I mean, a lot of the conversations that we were having with clients are what's happening with the boomers. And I think this is what's happening because this is what my parents are doing, or this is what's happening with the millennials because this is what my kids are doing. And so we said, let's reframe this conversation, come up with some better definitions of the generations, and then we have a better metric to measure and compare and contrast, so we can do a better job of forecasting what's going to happen demographically. So that was a big framework we set up in the book to really kind of just create some terms that people could get familiar with, that they could use as a basis for having the conversation and forecasting. And we went through each generation, decade by decade, and looked at what were the shifts that particular generation led us towards, and how are they going to behave in the future based on how they behaved in the past. And so.
And those shifts around spending, right? Presumably,
largely around spending. And again, we started out writing this for housing executives. I mean, we were trying to decide what's the right medium. Is it a white paper? Is it a series of videos? We ultimately decided on a book. And the deeper we got into the writing of the book, we realized this has such a broader audience than just housing executives, because really any business, anybody that relies on household formation and population growth for their business needs to understand these demographic shifts that are underpinning the demand for toothpaste or houses. It's really I've been amazed at how well this is translated to other parts of the.
I think you hit yourself on mute here.
I've just been amazed at how this is translated outside of the real estate industry. Not just, I get requests to speak at all kinds of conferences, so it's been great to see how well this has been received.
I'm curious, as you were writing that and collecting the data, was there anything in the data that was really shocking to you, or were these things that kind of intuitively you had known or heard about over the years?
You mentioned earlier, and there is a certain element of demographics that's predictable. I know that a year from now, God willing, I'm going to be a year older than I am today, and so we can kind of look at what's happening with what's the population today, and what does that mean for the population 10 years from now. But there are some things where it's less predictable. And so we went through and looked at what are the influences on demographic shifts in our country. And really, we kind of boiled it down to 4 categories of influence. I mean, it's government policy can influence demographic shifts. The economy, the state of the economy can certainly impact demographic shifts. Advances in technology and then also what we call societal shifts, and just the way that we've become, the way that shifts over time have become more the norm. So that the rate at which, or the age at which people are getting married has been pushed out, years from our parents' generation. Same with the rate at which people are having kids. And so, we look at how each of those 4 categories, government policy, the economic conditions, technology advances, and societal shifts, how those impact demographic shifts in our country. And we set up a framework in the book to kind of create a lens through which you can view those. So anytime the government makes a change in policy, anytime the economy shifts, anytime technology advances, anytime you have more sort of acceptance or shifting of these societal norms, think about how that impacts different generations differently, because it does impact them differently. And ultimately, what does that mean for demand, whether, again, it's for housing or, a consumer packaged good? Who thought that we'd have all of those 4 big influencers in play in such big ways as we have in the last couple of years? I mean, just in COVID, we've had so many instances where we had to think about, just the government policy that's being passed, the state of the economy. And it has had some clear impacts on demographic shifts. It's been a really helpful lens for us to view the economy and also view just the country as a whole through that lens.
Okay, now of those 4, I'm going to assume, and maybe I'm wrong, that societal shift might explain the baby boomer phenomenon, right? In the sense that families were putting off having more kids because of World War II. There was some hope that things would be better from that perspective. But talk about where does the baby boom formation fit into those 4 influences, and where are we in terms of what's most important for the here and now in terms of future population growth?
So the baby boom, we started off with the first wave of the baby boom starting in 1946, really hit its peak in the late 1950s, and then started to trail off in the early 1960s. It's interesting when you look at what led to that sort of decline in births in the next several years. I mean, it was really a combination of things, but a big part of it was the advent of the birth control pill. I mean, it just became more widely available. I mean, that's a technology shift, right? The invention or the creation of the birth control pill technology was really a technology shift. And so that really shaped demographics in the U.S. and that we had just, plummeting births into the mid 1970s as a result. It's interesting now that on the other end of the spectrum, technology through things like in vitro fertilization are now allowing, families to have kids later in life and have more kids. And so it's interesting how, you don't necessarily think of that as a technology shift, but it certainly is, and it impacts demographics in a big way. And so in terms of the baby boom, I mean, look, one of the reasons we named the group the born in the 1940s that sort of kicked off the baby boom, the Achievers, is because there were so many more of them born than in prior generations and prior years, and they're fighting for spots in college. They're fighting for jobs in the economy once they graduate from high school or college. And so we think that that fact that they were having to compete for these things led them to greater achievement in life. And so we did see a lot of a great success come out of that generation. We saw a lot of innovation coming out of that generation. We named that next generation, born in the 1950s, the innovators. You think about Steve Jobs and you think about Bill Gates and sort of their cohort. We had more entrepreneurship coming out of that generation than we've ever had and have seen since. And so that generation, both was born in the 40s, born in the 50s. They were workaholics, and they couldn't wait to move out of the house. They kind of living with their parents was a stigma, and so they were wanting to move out. They formed households like nobody else at that time, and so again, that kind of relates to their competitive nature, their achievement in life. And what happened was we had this really interesting phenomenon going on in the economy, where if you look at the 20 to 64-year-old population in the U.S., and that's just the broader population that we consider to be working age. That's 95% of full-time jobs in the U.S., 91% of all jobs if you include part-time. We were used to that that population, the pool from which we're pulling workers, growing at about 0.5% to 1.5% per year prior to the baby boom. And then all of a sudden, the boomers enter the workforce. And for decades, that working age population starts growing at a whole 0.5% higher than it had been for quite a while. And so now we're growing at 1 to 2% per year, that population from which we're pulling workers. Then what happens? The boomers start to retire in the mid 2010s or the early 2010s, and we see that that working age population growth really start to trail off to the point where now in 2021 we actually lost working age population. We lost about 300,000, or we just had a fall in the working age population of about 300,000 people. Yes, part of that was due to lower immigration in 2021, but that rate at which the working age population has been growing has been much slower in recent years since the boomers started reaching those ages where they retire. So what does that mean? It means we've got a tighter labor market just in general. And with the tighter labor market, you've got to do something to entice workers to stay in or come into the workforce. And so we think it contributes to higher wage growth because employers now have to compete more to lure workers into the workforce and to keep them there. And so really interesting, like how it's a clear example of how demographics can impact the economy. You're just growing your working age population at a slower rate, which means we've got a much tighter labor market.
But it's also interesting, right? Because the flip side of that, of course, is that as baby boomers retire, there should be less consumer demand for things and services more broadly. So yes, you have to compete, as an employer for a smaller pool of talent, but against that backdrop, you can make the argument that there's a new phase of divestment as opposed to investment, less consumerism because of age and retirement assets, and that then might balance some of those wage pressures higher.
But at the same time, we're living longer, and so it used to be the case that you retire at 65 and maybe you pass away at 75, so you've got a 10-year retirement. Now we're living much longer, and so people have a longer retirement that they need to finance, and so what maybe was 10 years is now a 30-year retirement or 25-year retirement. If they've got some net worth, they're still going to be consuming. And you need you need support for that. You need a working age population, you need employment growth to provide the goods and services for that older generation. So it's really interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the dependency ratios, but there's some ratios that you can look at. What's the population of 65 plus year olds in relation to sort of the more working age population, 15 to 64. And that number has gotten so much bigger here in the last couple of decades. Because of that aging of the population, they need more and more working age employees to kind of provide the goods and services for that older population.
Yeah, no, it's a valid point. It's just something that's interesting because it's funny how narratives change, because for the longest time, demographics were used as an explanation for why the longer term path for the economy, no matter what, is disinflation or even potentially outright deflation, like Japan, right? But now the narrative changed post COVID, where maybe actually demographics are more supportive towards inflation. What was the old narrative just not right? I mean, I'm just kind of curious how, because everyone seems to have forgotten that point that demographics were supposed to be disinflationary.
Yeah, I've got some team members, colleagues who are much better at explaining sort of the inflation situation better than I am. But I just think we've got this. We've got a growing population. It's just much more slow growing than it has been in the past. And so that said, we've kind of relooked at some of our forecasts recently to think about household formation, because for housing, household formation is key. And so I'm actually becoming a little bit more bullish on what's happening with household formation than I was even just a couple of years ago. Really, because we've seen a little bit stronger adult population growth than I think we were estimating, and like the census data that's coming out is fraught with some challenges right now. A lot of it collected during the pandemic, and so we know there's some challenges with that. But I do think from a household formation perspective, still slower than we've had in prior decades, but a little stronger than I was thinking even just a couple years ago.
All right, so this is interesting to me. The point you mentioned about entrepreneurship among those born in the 40s and 50s, the baby boomers, and how there was a stigma around living at home. You don't necessarily have the same stigma like you used to back then. I think especially post GFC. a lot of that change. But why is it that the millennial generation or generation after that, you think doesn't have as much desire to form new businesses? Because I would think entrepreneurship, the desire to maybe create a business would be fairly consistent as a percentage of any particular generation. But talk through
So
that
I will
dynamic.
say, I mean, the group born in the 1980s, we call them the sharers. They were very entrepreneurial. But it's just interesting, like as a share of, like we looked at new businesses started by the different generations, and it was that 1950s group that really did start businesses at a higher rate than ever before. Now, you would think you're exactly right that with technology being what it is today, and just sort of the ease of starting a business and going out on your own, it does seem much easier. But and quite frankly, there have been a lot of great successes, entrepreneurship wise, amongst the younger generations as well. Just when we looked at it from the perspective of what those 1950s innovators were doing in their early careers, and how many of those companies have sort of stood the test of time. Um, it's pretty amazing just to see how entrepreneurial that generation was. That was sort of the advent of computers. I mean, that's the 50s generation was fascinated by technology. They sort of grew up with the space race. And so they were really the first generation to incorporate more computer technology into their working lives. Certainly with the younger generations, the internet has been a parallel there. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about real quick, just we were talking about sort of these adulting milestones, right? So the younger generations not forming households at the same rate that maybe their parents had. And I think the millennial generation kind of got a bad rap. I think they got a lot of focus on this in the wake of the global financial crisis, because they were such a big group and they were kind of seen as, they are going to be the savior for the economy. And so when they were starting households at a lower rate than prior generations, there was so much focus on that. But really, these shifts have been going on for decades. And there's this fantastic graph that the Census Bureau had put together, and I've kind of been tracking it over time and updating it myself. But when you look at the percentage of like 30-year-olds hitting adulting milestones, so when I think about like living on their own or getting married or having kids or owning a home, I mean, yes, it does seem like the younger generations today are falling behind prior generations. But if you go back, I mean, these trends have been declining for decades. So I'll just to give you an example. Back in 1980, if you were 30 years old, there was an 86% chance you had moved out of your parents' house. By 1990, it was about 80%. By 2000, 30-year-olds was about 77%. Today it's in 2020, it was 67% of 30-year-olds had moved out and lived on their own at some point. So these trends have been going on for decades. Same thing with getting married. It used to be 83%. It's now 48%. Well, it didn't all happen with one generation. This has been going on for decades. Same thing with having kids. Same thing with owning a home. So, it's not as if it is unique to this particular generation of young adults. Young adults today. It's like it just got magnified in the wake of the great financial crisis, and so much focus on this generation. So it's pretty fascinating. And when I shared this graph on Twitter, and one of my friends posted on it. He said, you look at these trends for 30-year-olds hitting adulting milestones. He says, I think we need to redefine what an adult is, because it seems like they don't make them like they used to anymore. And just because somebody is not hitting these milestones at 30 doesn't mean they're never going to hit them. They're just happening later. And so in the instance of buying a home, if you're buying a home at 32 instead of buying a home at 26, you're still buying a home. And quite frankly, it's probably even a nicer home because you've got a little bit more life experience. Maybe you have a little bit more net worth or income. I don't think, these things are going away, but I do think that they're just being delayed and pushed off.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I don't know if you've done work on how that would look in countries outside the U.S., primarily emerging markets, but I'm curious what does that correlate to? If you're talking about it sounds like there's a structural force that's causing that trend to.
Yeah, so a big part of it is education. So we've got a more educated workforce than ever before. More educated young adult population. The time and the resources that they're putting into their education, the investment that they're making now with the hopes that it pays off either financially or, satisfaction-wise in the future. I do think that is largely responsible for some of those delays. So if you look at But if you were to draw a line comparing the rise of the college-educated population in the U.S. and contrast it against some of these trends for 30-year-olds, for example, I think there's a pretty strong correlation there. And I also think the fact that like college has become so much more expensive is only pushing these things up further. And so that's, yes, you've got a young adult generation that's more highly educated than ever before, but they also now have that student loan debt that goes along with that. And, for every $200, $300 you're paying a month in paying off your student loans, that's $200 to $300 that you don't have towards rent or towards, saving for a down payment on a home. And so a big part of this is related to education. I also think there's some more behavioral things that are going on as well. I think there's less of that stigma of living with your parents in your 20s than maybe it was for prior generations. And quite frankly, I think the parents are actually okay with that. I think parents, I've just heard from a number of peers and colleagues, like my parents would be really upset if I moved out of the house and I'm in my 20s. And so, I think there's some psychological or behavioral things that have shifted as well that maybe contribute to some of those shifts in just how we approach these kinds of adulting milestones. But again, I just want to point out that I don't think these are going away. I think people still want to get married. People still want to have kids. People still want to own a home. It's just happening later in life. Yeah, well, thanks, Howard. That's some great things to think about there. So a couple things. So you're talking about sort of that late 1950s, early 1960s. That was actually, and so I'm just looking at some stats right now on the number of children born per woman. So back in if you were born in the early 1930s, a woman might have had 3.3 kids on average. Born in the early 1940s, 2.6 kids. Born in the early 1950s, you had 2 kids on average. That it really kind of hit its bottom for that generation born in the late 1950s. They only had 2 kids on 2.0, and then it started to actually rise a little bit. So we've actually seen my generation born in the 70s rise a little bit with about 2.2 kids per woman. So I think you're right in that there is a lot of that generation born in the late 50s, early 60s that doesn't necessarily have heirs to pass their wealth on to. So yeah, I wonder if we will see more of sort of this charitable giving and upon their passing. And I applaud you. And I'm a big supporter of sponsoring kids in Africa. We've been doing that for a couple of years ourselves. But no, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. And then the other thing, talking about the generations by decade born, I mean, we toyed with the idea of breaking this down into 5-year increments, thinking that even somebody born 10 years apart from each other could have very different life experiences, as you point out. I mean, you said even just 2 or 4 years difference. We toyed with the idea of doing it in 5-year increments. And I think about like the group born in the early 1970s, when they graduated from college, they were kind of walking right into that, the dot-com boom. The generation born in the late 1970s, as they're graduating from college, they're walking almost right into the dot-com bust. And so, the way that the economy performed at the time that they were entering the workforce, it can kind of set the stage for how they start their careers and ultimately maybe even how they progress through their careers. We just found that it was just too cumbersome to try to break it down into 5-year groups. So we're sort of sticking with the 10-year increments. But you can even see some big shifts, as Howard mentioned, even between 2 halves of the same generation. So at least we put a little bit more granular approach to it. You can imagine how trying to compare somebody from born in 46 with somebody born in 64 could be just widely different experiences. We've got the book. We have a website, bigshiftsahead.com. It's got some of our analysis on there. We are constantly updating the reports or the infographics that are in our book. We did make it very infographic heavy. You can imagine we built the outline in PowerPoint and then wrote a book around that. So some information is available there. We are constantly updating these findings for our subscribing research clients. We get paid to run a subscription business to help clients understand what's happening. I think a lot of our book focused on the national level. What we do with our research is then we get into more granular because, again, we're focused on housing. Housing is local. You need to understand the local dynamics too, because you've got some pretty wide range of demographic outcomes depending on what part of the country you're in. And so check out our website, realestateconsulting.com. Our book website is bigshiftsahead.com. There's more information there, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share with you some of our more recent presentations that we've done that kind of look at how we look at the world through this demographic lens.
Chris, are these longer term demographic trends more conducive towards home buying or renting? Because one of the things which I think a lot of people are justifiably concerned with is what appears to be, renter nation,
Right.
right? That increasingly more and more people, just because of affordability, can't buy a house, and rents are getting so absolutely obscene to the point where even Cardi B
Yeah.
tweeted out about that. So talk about that, because I think the implication of demographics, I think, is interesting, not just in terms of affordability, but then obviously the link to mental health, right? Because if rents keep on going up, and now you got to keep on paying your student loans, and nothing becomes affordable, that may be a growing economy, but that's not a very healthy one for the psyche of society. If that
No,
makes
it makes
sense.
a lot of sense. And good luck on getting Cardi B on your Twitter Spaces. I saw you.
I'm ambitious. I'm not. I'm gonna try.
So you'd asked earlier about sort of when we wrote the book, was there anything that surprised us in the years after? I think the one spot where we missed it was on the call on homeownership rate. So we were calling based on demographic trends alone. We thought we would see the homeownership continue to decline. At the time that we wrote the book, it was declining, and we thought it would continue to decline for really demographic reasons. I think where we kind of missed it, and we outlined all of our assumptions that we used into making that call. We weren't expecting mortgage rates to go to 2% or fall below 3%, and we also weren't expecting that the mortgage lending policy would get a little bit looser than it had as suggested under Dodd-Frank, and still much tighter lending criteria today than we had in pre-GFC. But that's what I think is largely contributed to the rise in homeownership. Also, we weren't predicting a pandemic at the time that we think spurred a lot of household formation, and we think also spurred a rise into homeownership as well. The home just became so much more important to people because they were cooped up and they were trapped, during this first year of the pandemic. And also, I think huge impact has been the ability to work remotely. I think that has opened up so much more of the country to people who were previously tied to a particular location because they were tied to an office. I think the freedom to be able to work from really anywhere or virtually anywhere has really opened up a lot of the country to people. And again, I need more than two hands to count the number of my peers who have left Southern California to move to Texas or move to Tennessee. And quite frankly, they cashed out on their equity here. They paid cash for their homes in Texas or Tennessee, and they're going to probably even retire a couple of years early because of just that difference in cost of living. So I do think that we've seen more of a rise in homeownership than we were calling for, and I also think that that can reverse as we head into a recession. And so we are calling for what we think is probably going to be a mild recession. I think we can see some of that momentum that had been so directed at homeownership here these last several years start to dissipate a bit and start to be more of a push into rentership. So is it going to get down to the 61% that we were calling for when we wrote the book back in 2016? Probably not, but I wouldn't be surprised if it starts to plateau or even comes down a little bit, just because housing has gotten so much more expensive. And there is definitely a premium for owning. Rents, yes, are going up, but it's still in most markets cheaper to rent than it is to own.
Yeah, and there was also the other dynamic with those record low mortgage rates around more buyers of homes outside of their primary residence.
Correct.
Right? Turning properties into investment income as people got creative trying to find yield. They ended up using Airbnb and Verbos and all these things to monetize properties, which also creates a concentration of property owners and homeowners, which again goes back to sort of an underpinning potentially of needing to have more rentals as opposed to homes, because that's part of the inventory issue.
Right. And I know you talked with Rick about this, our director of research, about the sort of the single family rental space and how that has really stepped in and certainly, over the last decade has provided an opportunity for people to rent if they want to be in a good school district, they want their kids to have a backyard. And they, for one reason or another, choose not to own, or they're not able to own. I think that single family rental has really become a desirable alternative for people to, like I said, be in a detached home, good school district, desirable submarket, and have a backyard at the same time.
Let's talk about immigration for a moment, because one of the things that is often referenced when it comes to Japan, for example, is that they tend to not really have much immigration at all, and there's an argument to be made that you can't bring down the average age of a population to counter a massive debt load unless you actually have either more births or more people coming in, right? So talk about how immigration has changed or evolved. What are the trends there, and what are the implications on both housing and rentals?
Of course. Okay. So let's go back to the early 1900s. 13% of our country, actually 15%, if you look at like around 1910, 15% of our country was foreign born. And that, it was in the time of a massive wave of immigrants coming to the US, largely from Europe. You go to 1970, just 5% of our population was born outside the US. I mean, that's a huge shift in just, a short span of 60 years or so. And then what happened in the 80s and the 90s, we had more legislation. Again, this government policy that we're talking about, one of those big influencers of demographic shifts. Government policy allowed more, it eased the ability for immigrants to come into the US. And so we saw the foreign-born population in the US rise from 5% in 1970 all the way up to 13% by 2010, and probably up to about 14% today. So again, immigration, a government policy, has huge impacts on demographic shifts. If you look back at the last several decades, we've had about a third of our net population growth in the U.S. has been fueled by immigration. So there's 2/3 of it is the natural increase, births minus deaths, and then a third of the net population growth in the U.S. was really fueled by immigration. And we think actually we haven't got all the census data from 2020 yet, but I think it could be as high as 40% during the last decade. What's really fascinating is you look at what was going on with immigration trends back in 2011. We were adding about 800,000 net immigrants to the U.S. By 2016, it was about 1.1, just under 1.1 million net immigration. And then over the next several years, that number just plummeted. And it was even before COVID. And some would say, okay, that's a function of the administration that was in place at the time that was seen as less friendly to immigrants. But I mean, we got to the point where, by 2019, we were less than 600,000 net immigration. 2021, we added about 250,000 immigrants. Now, we'd effectively shut off our borders. So, that number had plummeted, but that's below even the census's low immigration scenario. Their main immigration scenario was about 1 million or so per year. And we're talking about 250,000. So, that's what's contributed to the majority of the drop in the population in the U.S., in the population growth in the U.S., I should say, over the last several years is just this slowing in immigration. So here's the dilemma I think that we're faced with is, on the one hand, we've gone through this global health crisis. Are we going to be a little bit more protective of how many people we allow into the country? But at the same time, I think, the U.S. is very, very desirable. So many people wanting to come to the U.S., and you see this in some of the immigration visa application numbers. I mean, people want to come to the U.S. So I think the demand to come to the U.S. is strong. It'll just be, interesting to kind of observe this over the next several years, how government policy adjusts or doesn't adjust, and what that impacts on immigration. So our thought is, we're coming from a very, very low level, the lowest I've seen in forever. I think we are going to go back to more of a normal level of immigration in the U.S., probably more aligned with 1 million or so. I think it's probably 1 million a year. I think it's probably a couple years off. So we're going to kind of gradually ramp up to that. I think, if you look at the population, so there's 14% of the U.S. is foreign born. That has the immigration has really helped to fill in some of the gaps that were caused by those dips that were caused by a drop in births. So the generation born in the 1970s, very low number of births. Immigration has really helped to kind of fill in some of those dips, to the point where 1 in 4 people in the U.S. today, born in the 1970s, was born outside of the U.S. That's 1 in 4. That's like an amazing number. That's your group that's in their 40s today, right? Younger generations have a smaller percentage of foreign-born population, and that's really because people tend to move here in their 20s and their 30s. So I think as big as those groups are today, of people born in the 90s, people born in the 2000s in the US, they're going to get bigger over time through immigration. And quite frankly, we've got such a tight labor supply you can't wait 20 years for a baby born today to enter the workforce. If you need workers now, the only way to add adults to the population is really through immigration. So I think it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch over the next couple of years.
And is it fair to say that a lot of the political actions and systems, the way that America works in general, that it requires a population growth of a certain percentage every year to maintain things? Because I think this is, again, going back to the Japan example, the argument is always that you need a younger generation to support an older generation. You need enough people in the younger generation to support what is supposed to be the older generation, and now that dynamic isn't really there because births have been decelerating. So your only counter is immigration. But to your point, now government policy creates a volatile dynamic there because it depends on who's president and who's in charge. So how did
So I mean, if you look at the numbers right now, you've got nearly an equal number of people turning 65 as you do people turning 20. And so for every person that's leaving the workforce at 65, you're replacing them almost essentially one for one with somebody who's 20 years old on the other end of the age spectrum, who's now sort of entering that working age population. And again, I'm picking 20 as halfway between 18, somebody graduating high school, and somebody who's 22 graduating college. That I talked about that working age population growing at a slower rate than we've ever seen before. That's it. I mean, that's the reason we've got a lot of people retiring, and we've got an equal number of people coming of age. And so if you want to, if you're growing the working age population at less than half a percentage point, how can you expect to grow jobs at 2% if you don't have a pool that's growing at 2% to pull them from? So you either have to entice more people into the labor force who are already in that age group, or you've got to add workers through immigration.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point. All right, so listen, as we're at the top of the hour here, everybody, please, again, make sure you follow Chris Porter. Check out his book as well, Big Shifts Ahead. Just curious as a way to close this off, Chris. What do you think people get wrong about? What do you think that people get wrong about the demographics discussion about some of these major trends? Because it's a very, especially when it comes to immigration, it can be a political hot button. But if you were to take a step back and just objectively look at the data, what do you think people misunderstand about demographics currently?
Yeah, I kind of come back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, and that's just that we have having all these cocktail conversations about what's happening with the millennials and what's happening with the boomers. And again, I think a lot of that is based on people's own experiences. Here's what they see with going on with their parents, or here's what they see going on with their kids. And it's a great anecdote. But at the end of the day, I think there are some real numbers behind some of these trends. And so we can do a certain amount of prediction based on demographics. There are things you can't predict as well from demographics. Again, you can't predict a pandemic that is going to influence demographic shifts in the way that it has. So I think that people could really benefit from digging into the numbers, from doing their own analysis on what's actually happening with these demographic shifts, as opposed to just kind of relying on cocktail conversation and anecdotes. Because I think there's a lot of surprising things in there as well. I mean, some of the, I think the one that really stands out to me is we talked about the 30-year-olds and just sort of the adulting milestones and how that's not a new thing. That is something that's been going on for decades. And so that's maybe one thing that really jumps out at me is just a lot of these shifts have been going on for decades. And I think people just aren't as focused on that aspect of it.
Right. They think it's something that's like a brand new sudden phenomenon, but it's a longer-term trend that's in place. I think that's valid. Exactly. Yeah. So again, everybody, please make sure you follow Chris. This was a phenomenal conversation. I'm going to have another space in about an hour with Charles Payne of Fox Business. Stay tuned for that. Thank you, Chris. I really do appreciate your knowledge and experience.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.